Hi, everybody. This week I want to go over essay 3 and talk a little bit about that. So we're just going to jump right into the assignment. So this is our third essay. It is called a rhetorical analysis. Don't let the name scare you. Minimum of 3 pages this time. So we've gone up a page in length, and that does not include your works cited page. And I'll go on to explain it some more. So for rhetorical analysis, you're going to analyze the rhetoric of a text. And the rhetoric is really kind of a fancy word for language or style that somebody is using. So what you want to do is determine an argument, what the person is arguing, and the strategies that that person is using. Oftentimes, you'll have a person who's really effective at giving a speech, right? They're just one of those people that is just really moving. Well, there's certain tools that people use to achieve those things. So we're going to kind of talk about that. I'm not going to go over, there's reading before the assignment about rhetorical analysis, what different things mean. So you'll need to do that. So the purpose of a rhetorical analysis is not to just describe the technique or the strategy, but to also analyze how those devices in the argument actually make it succeed or fail. So you want to show where and why the argument makes sense and where it falls apart. I would recommend just doing the positive parts. You don't want to do both. You want to say this is an effective argument, or you want to say it's an ineffective argument, but don't do both. So here's the tricky part. The hardest part of a rhetorical analysis is to keep your distance from the topic. It doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with the author's point of view, or whether that you think that's even like an important topic in the sense that like you agree with them. You're only to focus on how well or poorly the argument works. Thus, your claim should address the rhetorical effectiveness of the argument, not the opinion or position it takes. In addition, you want to take into account the information from our textbook. So think about what makes a good argument when somebody's trying to persuade you of something. What makes a person credible? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So here's some key information. Here's an example thesis, from, let's say I was doing a rhetorical analysis of the famous piece, Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. And he has a lot of great speeches that you can analyze. I don't recommend doing I Have a Dream. That's an amazing speech, but it's overdone and there's a lot written about it. And so I would recommend using one of the others. But let's say you did Letter from a Birmingham Jail. So this would be a sample thesis. In Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King effectively argues that African Americans should protest for civil rights through his brilliant use of ethos, pathos, and logos. So in that thesis, I've got what his argument is. He's saying that people need to protest. And then how does he do it? He does it with those 3 strategies. There's other ways you can do it. That's an example of one, right? I've given you some lists of things that you can write your analysis on. We'll talk about that in a minute. But a controversial topic is always the best speech to use. You really want to do a speech. Don't use I or you, don't use contractions, use academic voice. The introduction should give some context. Tell us a little bit about the speech, why it's being given, who's giving it, maybe a little bit about the author. If you look that up, you want to cite that. But then the thesis should clearly state whether the speech or paper that you're analyzing is an effective or ineffective argument and why. Don't use so many quotes from the essay that you just end up repeating the words of the author. You want the majority of the essay to be your own ideas. Analyze the rhetoric, don't summarize it. There's a big difference between Analysis and summary. Summary just is repeating, oh, the author says that we should protest for civil rights. It's like, sure, that's exactly what he says. I want some analysis of that. So you want to pick out the meaty stuff to analyze. And you should do more than say, this is an example of pathos. You want to say how or why it's an example of pathos. So some ideas, these are just ideas. You can pick your own speech, the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Sentiments. These are famous speeches in history with Winston Churchill, Malcolm X, Elie Wiesel, Cesar Chavez, Sojourner Truth. I've listed a couple more. There's a lot of great TED Talks that you could pick, that you could use. And so you can look down at that list or choose your own. That's fine. You also want to look at the rubric to look at the rubric and see where the points are assigned. So they do change with the essay. So you want to check that out. The one thing that I want to spend a minute showing you is I did post a sample student analysis because this essay students tend to get off track a little bit. So I am going to show you that one. I'm not going to read the whole thing. No, when I say, a minimum of 3 pages, I want to point out that that's a minimum, a C is a minimum. So anyway, but I'm bringing up this sample student paper partly because I annotated it. I made some notes that you might find helpful. Let me see if I can make that a little bigger. Okay, so this one, I'm just going to read the introduction. So a year and a month ago, before Sheryl Sandberg, Chief Executive Officer at Facebook, walked across the UC Berkeley stage to deliver a commencement speech full of authenticity, she found her husband dead on the gymnasium floor. The UC Berkeley graduating class of 2016 may have been expecting a speech about women overcoming adversity, as Sheryl Sandberg is an advocate for women in business. And though these themes are woven throughout her speech, she opens herself up to these students, allowing a deeper understanding into a part of her life which she had never shared with anyone until this commencement speech. Sheryl Sandberg, a cunning woman who changed the advertising strategies of Facebook, shape a pathway for success, did not speak of her astonishing achievements and huge influence in the business realm. Rather, she humbled her story for the students, avoiding a success story to share what she learned in the face of adversity. Her sweet and sincere tone, containing well thought out pauses and breaks when needed, simplifies the lessons she gained from hardship in a more relatable format for newly graduated college students. And then here's her thesis statement. Through Sandberg's use of anaphora, juxtaposition, irony, humor, and the rhetorical technique of pathos and logos, she fights through tears to convey a theme of resilience to the audience, portraying how the adversity she faced in death only offered her a life of gratitude, a juxtaposing yet powerful claim. So it's a clear thesis. She mentions the rhetorical strategies that she's going to be discussing, and also what the author's basic points are. So that's really good. And the beginning of that gave some context about the speech. So one thing you don't want to do in this essay that I see a lot of students do are things like the audience feels this way. Like when the speaker says this, the audience feels A, B, and C. And it's like, you don't know how the audience feels, so you can't really say that. But look at some of her topic sentences for her paragraphs. Through sharing the empowering history of the university and how it influenced the life she currently has the opportunity of living, Sandberg sets the context for her speech to establish a trustworthiness to her audience. So this whole paragraph is going to be about how she establishes being trustworthy. There's lots of ways a person can come across trustworthy, even from the clothes they wear. If the president of the United States were to get up and give a speech and he was wearing like shorts and a t-shirt and hadn't shaved or something, you might be kind of thinking, hey, wait a minute, you're the president of the United States and maybe you should look a little more presidential. But when the president gives a speech and there's the presidential seal behind him, and oftentimes, presidents will reference history. I mean, that's one way of showing their credibility, that they've learned from history or they study history. So these are all ways that people establish credibility. And there's all different kinds of ways to do that. But she goes on to talk about how she does that. Other topic sentences here. As she reflects on the history of her past, Sandberg brings the speech back to the present through her use of anaphora. So she's going to talk about anaphora, which is a type of repetition. Martin Luther King did it in I Have a Dream, where he said, I have a dream that one day, and I have a dream that one day. And he repeats that so often that it has become one of the most iconic phrases in the American language, right? When we hear that phrase, I have a dream, we automatically think of Martin Luther King. And so it's your job to analyze, why is that effective? Why is that so memorable? Why has that become, why is repeating something like that such an effective tool when a person is making an argument? So I'm not going to go over everything. You can certainly, look at this essay. You can read about it. Some of the, I marked some of the insightful commentary that is made in this essay. But that's just kind of a brief overview of rhetorical analysis. But notice how, this speech is really about being grateful for life, right? But the essay is not about, oh yeah, it's important to be grateful for your life because, life can pass us by really fast. That is not what the essay is about. The essay is about arguing how effectively she made her argument. Wow, she made a really good argument that it's important to be grateful. She does this because, number one, she's credible. Number two, she uses logic. She talks about research. She gives data. That's your logos coming in when you talk about when somebody gives data or research or they use logic. That's another rhetorical strategy that people use to win over their audience. So that's another example. If you're struggling with rhetorical analysis, you can always reach out to me. I can give you some tips. You can always let me know what your thesis is, and I can let you know if you're on the right track. Otherwise, I don't want to spend too much time on it. You do have some reading to do, and you have some practice with the rhetorical analysis this week with the discussion, because you need to watch the TED Talk and then talk about the rhetorical strategy that the person uses in the TED Talk that I've assigned this week. So let me know if you have any questions. You can use the Writing Center. You can email me, and I will talk to you soon.